Okay, so again, we're going to get started with bearded buddies preparing for bearded dragon ownership. So I thought we could start with just some beardy basics. So I'd like to introduce you to your bearded dragon so you can get to know the species a little bit better before we get into the specifics of keeping these animals in your home. So the common name, of course, we're all familiar with is bearded dragon. Their scientific name is Pagona, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in just one second here. Of course, they are a reptile. And they are omnivores. So we will talk about dietary needs in captivity towards the end of the presentation. But these are omnivorous reptiles. However, as they age, they do rely more and more heavily on plant matter over animal matter. Their average lifespan is about 4 to 10 years, 4 being more realistic for our wild bearded dragons that are subject to droughts, lack of resources, so lack of food, lack of shelter, and of course predation. So they tend to live on the shorter end of that lifespan spectrum, where bearded dragons in captivity almost always hit that 9-10-year-old mark. I have, however, known a few lucky bearded dragon guardians who had dragons that have far exceeded that. The oldest that I have ever encountered was about 16 years old. So it is certainly possible, and I always stress to everyone to be prepared for that possibility if you bring a reptile into your home. But more often than not, they tend to live for about 10 years, some a little bit more, some a little bit less. Their size is typically between 18 and 22 inches. That is incorporating their tail as well. So without that tail, you can usually reduce their size by 4 to 5 inches, depending on your dragon. Males tend to be a little bit bigger than your females. And that will be true as well for their weight, which is typically between 10 and 18 ounces. In captivity, and we'll talk about this as an issue, they tend to be on the heavier side, oftentimes to their detriment. So one of the common afflictions that we see with captive bearded dragons, just like we see with a lot of other household pets, is obesity. So that's why it is very important to make sure that we monitor their diet. And we'll also talk about exercise a little later on as well. So here pictured on the slide, you can see this is a wild bearded dragon in a natural habitat. So you can see this particular dragon, I would say, is a little bit lean. I'd like to see a little more meat on those bones, but this is basically the body type we should be striving for. You'll see some captive bearded dragons as we go through the presentation, mine included, who's a little bit chubby. So you can see how captivity does impact their body type just a little bit. All right, so first, to help you all get to know your bearded dragons a little bit better, I wanted to introduce you to the natural beardy. So where our bearded dragons are from, how they exist in the wild, and how they interact with their environment. Having this information can help us better prepare for keeping them in our homes, especially when it comes to enrichment and exercise. Understanding the species can allow you to provide them species-specific entertainment and exercise opportunities, which will help them both physically and mentally in your home. So when we talk about the natural beardy, they are native to Australia, and they can actually be found throughout the entire continent. These reptiles are incredibly hardy, and they're capable of existing in multiple environment types. Now, throughout this continent, we also see a lot of variation in our bearded dragons. So there are 8 species of bearded dragons, all with that initial genus name Pagona, and then they have a species-specific name that follows. So you can see the variety listed below, and you can also see here on this map, each species is specific to a particular area in Australia. So these individuals are highly adapted for specific biomes, whether that be scrubland, desert, more temperate forest, and woodland areas. They all are highly adapted to a particular type of environment. Now, out of these 8 species, There is the opportunity to keep most as pets, but the most common is Pagona viticeps, and that particular species of bearded dragon is a desert dwelling, sometimes scrub dwelling reptile. So that's definitely something to keep in mind as you're developing an appropriate habitat for your beardy. You want to think about the conditions that they would encounter naturally. That's what their body is going to be well adapted for, and that type of environment would provide them appropriate mental stimulation as well as physical. So when we talk about habitat, again, we have another beautiful beardy pictured on the slide in his native Australia. We do, again, see a variety of biomes where these bearded dragons exist and thrive. Their preference is for arid, so dry and warm climates. So we do see them commonly in deserts. However, I do like to stress to anybody interested in bringing a bearded dragon home that deserts don't always mean sand. So you can actually see this bearded dragon. There is certainly a sandy component to this biome that he's existing in, but a lot of it is going to be composed of shrubs and the detritus that falls off of these shrubs. And then the deserts in Australia are more rocky, generally speaking, than sandy, at least where we see these bearded dragons in their greatest abundance. So when we are setting up a desert-like biome for them in their habitat, we have to keep that in mind. They don't live in thick, dense sand. They have, at best, a thin layer of sand and then more of a rocky substrate underneath them naturally. We do also see bearded dragons in subtropical woodlands, savannas, and scrublands. So even though Pagona viticeps, which is the particular species of bearded dragon that we most commonly see in the homes, are desert dwellers, we can incorporate some elements from these other biomes, and you'll find your bearded dragons will be highly entertained by that environmental enrichment. Now, bearded dragons, both captive and wild, are masters of comfort. They like to get cozy, and they often do that by finding a nice lounging space. Bearded dragons are reptiles that are referred to as semi-arboreal, which means that they do climb, but they're not super adventurous climbers. So where you might see some reptiles, some geckos, chameleons, iguanas, lizards typically that you find in more tropical environments, they can be very adventurous and they'll climb quite high and enjoy that type of physical enrichment. Our bearded dragons, they'll enjoy a subtle climb, but if it is too high or too steep of an incline, they're not going to bother with it. But in the wild and in captivity, you will find them at moderate heights as long as the climb is pretty easy. They like to sprawl out there and bask in the sunlight or that artificial light that we'll create for them to help maintain their body temperature. Now in the wild, if they become too warm, because we do have to consider all reptiles are ectotherms, so they rely on the environment to warm and cool them. They can't do that internally. Bearded dragons are also burrowers, so they do like to have dim, cool places to relax in, to cool off their bodies. It also helps them feel secure. So we see that in the wild. This is something that we would also want to emulate in captivity as well. Now, when we talk about diet in the wild for bearded dragons, they are not terribly particular. They'll try just about anything as a food option. If it's smaller than them, in their mind, it is food. So in the wild, they're known to have a highly varied diet. Again, they are omnivorous. So when we talk about that animal protein that they may be getting, that's going to be heavily reliant on insects, especially slow moving insects. So grubs, worms, larger beetles, things like that. They're going to dine on those preferentially. Bearded dragons are not the most adept hunters. So if it's something that's quite fleet of foot, bearded dragons are going to have a hard time catching it. They are known to consume small mammals as well. So small mice and other rodents and smaller lizards as well can all be fair game for food for our bearded dragons. In terms of plant life, literally anything they can get a hold of, they will consume. Bearded dragons are avid grazers, so they do enjoy grazing. They will eat a variety of species of grass and multiple types of flowers as well. because they are not the most adept hunters in the world. They will, even though they are omnivorous, they will rely heavily on plant life to sustain themselves and maintain that calorie intake that they need to keep a healthy body weight. So we'll also see typically that preference in our bearded dragons in captivity as well. They'll enjoy eating insects, some a little bit more than others, but as they get older, they rely more and more heavily on plant life to sustain themselves. Now, in terms of body language and behavior for our bearded dragon friends, they are very expressive creatures. So they can display a wide range of emotions and are quite clear with their body language, how they're feeling and how they're perceiving their environment. So I threw this graphic up just for fun. I found it online. I thought it was pretty hilarious. And while there are definitely some typos in here, they have nailed a lot of the typical body positions that we see in our bearded dragons. So alert beardies, you will see a posture like this. They have a very telltale head raise. So you'll see it flip up. You'll typically see the bottom of their chin when they're overly alert. That's them really scanning their environment. They do have their eyes on the side of their head. So just like a lot of prey animals, they have to rotate back and forth to be able to see clearly all the way around them. So you'll see that head raise. A very alert bearded dragon will also almost do a beardy push-up. So they're gonna push up on those front legs, make themselves look a little bit taller, gives them a better view as well. You will also see the tip of their tail raise. So that's a good cue that your bearded dragon is alerted to something in the environment that they want to keep a closer eye on. That tail, much like a cat, is very telling for their emotional state. And they will oftentimes also flip their tongue out. So bearded dragons do get a lot of their environmental information through taste. So if you do have a bearded dragon in your home or you are considering bringing one into your home, do not be alarmed if they attempt to lick you. That is just their way of trying to figure you out and learning who you are and kind of how you fit into their environment. I have a bearded dragon. Again, I have 3 dogs and they are completely intimidated by her, and she actually loves to run behind them and she licks them as she gets closer. She's not meaning any harm, she's trying to learn more about them, but it definitely keeps them on edge a little bit. If you have a resting and relaxed beardie, which is what hopefully we are seeing when we have our dragons in our homes, you're going to see a very flat body. So bearded dragons are all about comfort. And they don't like to expend a lot of energy unnecessarily, which makes sense. That's going to be true for all reptiles because their metabolism works so slowly. They like to keep their energy levels down because it just takes so long for them to metabolize food and kind of regain those energy stores. So when your bearded dragon is resting or relaxed, you'll see that body laying flat, that belly is going to be against the ground. You will see the head either down on the ground or semi-raised. You might see occasional tongue flicks if they're sort of lazily enjoying their environment, but not a whole lot of motion. And this is really the state that bearded dragons spend most of their days in, particularly when we talk about dragons in captivity, where they have less concerns with predation and no real need to have to hunt either. They're going to spend a lot of their time relaxing, which is why we do see a little bit more obesity in our bearded dragons in captivity than we do see in the wild. They really only move when they have that reason to alert, and in captivity, those reasons tend to diminish pretty significantly. Now, similar to their resting and relaxed pose, you can see a warming up and comfort pose here. When dragons need to raise their body temperature, they are going to bask. So they require that heat from the sun to warm themselves. This is where they're typically going to choose that arboreal option for themselves. So they'll climb, they'll get a little closer to that source of the heat. They are going to usually either close their eyes or they'll have sort of slitted eyes when they're warming up. Bearded dragons can be sensitive to bright lights, even if it's natural sunlight. You'll definitely see that in captivity when we've got bulbs a little closer to them. You'll see that sort of slitted eye as well because they're trying to protect their their eyeballs basically from that heat and the dryness that follows. They will try to flatten out their bodies as much as possible when they're warming up because they're creating as much surface area as they can to absorb all of that heat. If they become too warm and they need to cool a little bit, you will see their mouths open. That way we can see a cooling effect from the saliva on their tongues actually evaporating. It's the same thing that we see with alligators that sit by the side of a river with their mouths wide open. It's the same thing that we actually see dogs doing as well when they pant. They just have a little bit of a different way of going about it. But that allows some temperature regulation. So if a dragon's nice and comfy and they're warming up, and they get a little too warm, you're going to see that mouth open up so they can have that evaporative effect from the moisture in their mouth to cool them down a little bit more. Now the last posture, and we will have some videos and other images as well to show, that we definitely want to pay attention to with our bearded dragons are our angry bearded dragons. So this is part of the reason I included this slide, because this just amused me endlessly. But our angry bearded dragons are going to look like this guy here pictured on the slide. They want to make themselves look big and bad when they are angry. So they're going to open up their mouths very, very wide. They are going to flatten and widen their bodies. When you take a look at bearded dragons, you'll see spikes along their sides. They look pretty non-threatening when a bearded dragon is in a relaxed pose. So you can even see here in the drawings, the spikes almost just look flat against their body. When they become angry or if they are fearful of predation, as they flatten their body, those spikes actually stick straight out and they can become quite sharp and very aversive to anybody trying to handle that dragon. Whether that's us in captivity or a predator in the wild. They will also extend their beard. So that is where they get their name. They have an excess of skin right underneath their chin. And as they get angry, they can actually puff that out. It increases their perceived size. And as they become more and more aroused, that beard will begin to blacken and gives them a very intimidating look. And it looks like they have a big black beard, much like Bluto from Popeye, that nice big black beard that's meant to intimidate. Bearded dragons also will hiss when they are angry. Their hiss, though, sounds a little bit different than what you might expect. It's not a cat hiss. It actually sounds almost like wind going through a tunnel. And I do have an example of that coming up here in the next slide. All right, so because this can be very intimidating, especially for our new bearded dragon owners, when we talk about behavior, I did want to first show some aggressive posturing. So this is what a bearded dragon looks like when they are angry. Definitely not an animal that you want to tangle with and spend any more time than necessary with. So here in this picture, you can see the flattened body, and you can tell the difference between an angry bearded dragon that flattens its body and a relaxed bearded dragon that flattens their body because of the posture with their legs. So a relaxed bearded dragon may have this flat look to them, but their legs are going to be loose and limp on their sides. They're just expanding their surface area for heat absorption. When they're angry, intimidated, or feel threatened, they're actually going to stand upright, which for a bearded dragon is, you know, still kind of curvy, but they're going to try to stand upright on their legs, give themselves a heightened appearance. They're going to flatten out their body, and usually they'll have that sort of tilt to them. You can see here, and then you can see all of those spikes on the side right here are sticking straight out. That would prevent predators from being able to scoop them from above. Bearded dragons will also use that for us if they don't want to be picked up. Here is that infamous black beard that's puffed up and darkened. And then that bearded dragon is showing off the business right there. A wide open mouth. That dragon is saying, keep coming and I'm gonna bite you. So they're trying to look as intimidating as possible. Now in this video, we'll see a very unhappy bearded dragon in captivity demonstrating these same behaviors. Let me get this going here.
Thank you.
So this bearded dragon is not happy. And hopefully you all can hear that sound, that almost like a gust of wind. Let's see if it'll do it again. So right there, sounds like wind through a tunnel. That is a bearded dragon's hiss. So this bearded dragon is very unhappy. He's flattening himself out as his guardian is filming and getting closer. He's expressing his discomfort and displeasure. His mouth opens wider. That beard is nice and black, and he's hissing to appear more intimidating. So this is a bearded dragon that is very clearly saying, back off, please. So obviously in the wild, if we saw this, hopefully a predator would think twice about approaching. We should also think twice about approaching in captivity. So one thing that I would like to point out here as this individual is filming, I appreciate the video for educational purposes, but if your dragon is doing this to you or towards you in captivity, really try to heed that and back off. Continuing to film and kind of harass your dragon as this gentleman is doing is only going to harm that relationship that you form with them. Bearded dragons definitely can form bonds with their humans, but we have to make sure we're being respectful of their wishes, which sometimes we forget about with our smaller friends. So if you see a bearded dragon doing this, and this is a clear sign, back off. You want to respect that, give them space, and you can return and try interactions again once that beard has lightened up and flattened and they've assumed a more relaxed position. All right, so other behaviors that we see commonly with bearded dragons that are often misunderstood are some of their behaviors that demonstrate submission and arousal. And I wanted to include videos of these because I see so many bearded dragon guardians kind of enjoying these behaviors, and I think this comes from misunderstanding. So the first is the bearded dragon wave. So I'll show the video here so you can see what I am referring to. We'll get this going here. All right, so see that nice slow wave in the air, and there's a couple kiddos in here that'll wave for us. There's another one. There's kind of a lazy wave right there. So it's a nice slow rotation. I see countless videos of bearded dragons waving on social media, on YouTube, and the typical response that I see is why I wanted to include it in this presentation, because I see the waves and then everybody comments, "That's so adorable, I wish my bearded dragon waved, how do we get him to do that?" And I wanted to put this on here because we don't want to see our bearded dragons waving. If you bring a juvenile dragon into your home, you're more likely to see this behavior. What it is saying in bearded dragon body language is, I mean you no harm. So you are frightening me and I am trying to demonstrate that I don't want to participate in any altercations. So they're trying to demonstrate submission. They're trying to demonstrate a little bit of fear as well. It's not uncommon to see that with very small juvenile dragons because everything in the world is so much bigger and more intimidating to them. So they tend to wave, and I would definitely say that's acceptable as you begin to build a relationship with a dragon, but you don't want to see it on a regular basis. So if you've got a bearded dragon set up in your home and they're waving all the time, they're telling you that something in that environment is distressing to them. So that's definitely a reason to take in the environment, see what might be causing that stress, and do what you can to alter that environment to create a more comfortable scenario for your dragon. So while I agree that behavior really is stinking cute, and I mean, it's cute, I get it, we don't want to see it because that's a sign of mental unhealth in our dragon. They are stressed, and that's not how we want any of our pets to experience the world. Now, the other behavior that also can be concerning is the head bob. So we see dragons head bobbing for several reasons. We'll get this video going. There we go. And it can be very dramatic, like this particular kid here. So that's a very elaborate head bob. And he's a little stressed because he's sliding on that couch. There it is again. So very distinct. And you can see this particular kiddo is also getting a little black bearded. So head bobbing can be done for multiple reasons. It can be because of arousal. So we'll see dragons ready to mate do a lot of head bobbing. You might see some black bearding as well, particularly with the males, because they're trying to show off to the girls that that they're feeling amorous, and they want those girls to know that they're big and bad and sexy. So they're going to show off the goods by head bobbing. But we can also see that when your dragons are just flat out overstimulated. So if there's a lot of action going on in the room, again, you might see that head bobbing behavior. Sometimes we see that head bobbing as well as a submissive behavior. Typically, it will be paired with some of those waving motions as well. So you might get a wave and then a big head bob and then a wave and another head bob. Either way, we don't want to see excessive head bobbing in our dragons. So if it's limited, so maybe you have a party going on in the house and the dragon's head bobbing a little bit, but when things calm down, the behavior ceases, that's okay. It's okay for animals to experience some level of stress or overexcitement from time to time. We all do. But if it's a constant behavior, again, this is another reason to reassess your environment, because we wouldn't want to exist in a state of over-arousal and tension all the time, and we don't want to do that to our animals either. So for both of these behaviors, they're cute. You see tons of memes and videos of them all over the internet, but they're not desirable behaviors, because this is a bearded dragon communicating that they are experiencing some level of stress, whether that's fear or submission or just heightened arousal. It's not a way that we want our dragons to be existing in a consistent basis from day to day. So on occasion, that's okay. But if it's happening a lot, we need to reassess their environment. There we go. All right. So now that we've learned a little bit about bearded dragons, where they come from and how they behave, let's take a look at what we can do for them as pets. So this is actually my bearded dragon right there. That's Beetle. She has been my pet for the last 6 years now. And she actually came to me in pretty bad shape because she came from a home that was really well-intentioned, but just not well-educated. So she had some calcium deficiencies, she had some weak bones, and just really poor quality scales as well. So it took some time to get her back into prime shape, but it is possible. So if you do have a dragon that you think might not be in the best health, it is definitely something we can correct with proper husbandry. So let's take a look at what that means. Okay. So first and foremost, if you are a potential bearded dragon owner and you're thinking about adding one to your family, I always like to start off any conversations about adding a pet to your home with the adopt or shop discussion. So with reptiles, a lot of folks don't realize that there are a lot of adoption options out there for you. So many shelters will have reptiles available for adoption. At DuPage County, we do periodically, but more often than not, what you'll be looking for an adoption choice would be going to a reptile rescue. So we specifically, when we get a lot of reptiles in, we send them to reptile rescues because that means the reptiles can live in a foster home and they can be more regularly monitored, and then more information can be gained about them before they go into a forever home. Now, the bonuses of adopting over shopping is that any rescue or shelter that you adopt from is already going to have provided medical care. So the reptiles will get a full examination. If they have any physical ailments or illnesses, those will be treated and tended to before they go home. If they have any long-term or ongoing conditions, you would be informed of those, and they would provide information and potentially supportive care to help you get started with a dragon if you did choose to adopt one that was special needs. You'll also get quite a bit of guidance on appropriate setup and care for your dragon that will be more specific and correct than what you will likely encounter if you purchase from a pet store. And again, there's going to be that availability of support after the animal goes home. So most rescues and shelters are happy to answer any questions, even if it's 6 months, a year, several years down the road. If something pops up, you have these resources available to you when you need that extra help or input. Now, if you do decide to purchase a bearded dragon, I would advocate strongly for going to a reputable breeder. And there are several, even in this area, there are quite a few. But you want to avoid commercially bred reptiles, which means you want to steer clear of pet store reptiles. And you also want to steer clear of the reptile swaps that I'm sure we've all seen pop up all around, well, all around the country, frankly, but we do see a fair number of them in Illinois. These are going to be animals that were raised in a commercial setting. I know we're all familiar with puppy mills. What a lot of people don't realize is that there are mill-bred animals of pretty much every species that we see kept in captivity as pets. And that will ring true for bearded dragons as well. So the dragon here that I have pictured is actually a breeding dragon from a mill situation. This is a mill that supplies some of our big box store pet stores with their bearded dragons. And you can see here, she's actually missing one of her back legs, and the stump that's remaining is actually infected and rotting. She's not getting appropriate care. You can see there's no effort whatsoever to provide her with any species-specific enrichment. She's in a sterile white box. There's nothing to look at. There's nothing to do. There's no appropriate and natural terrain for her. So she is likely incredibly stressed. And I would actually say that she definitely is, because you can see all of these black lines around her back here. Bearded dragons will become generally darker throughout their body as they experience stress. So when you see a lot of those dark lines, that's an indicator that you have an unhappy or an unhealthy dragon. And unfortunately, her story is what we see for any dragons that are coming from these commercial facilities. They're raised in poor conditions. They have limited, if any, interactions with people. So that also means that the juvenile dragons that are ultimately shipped to pet stores or are held for sale in reptile swaps, they haven't been handled. So they're not acclimated well to humans, which means that when you bring them home, you're essentially bringing home a wild animal that may or may not want anything to do with you. So you have to put in quite a bit of work to socialize them. And in many cases, because of that rough start that they have, they're never quite as sociable as an animal that was raised correctly, either in a shelter or rescue setting or with an appropriate, reputable breeder. Additionally, these animals typically receive limited or poor medical care. So we see a lot more parasitic infections, a lot more deformities, and other issues, which we will talk about here in just a little bit. They're more common in reptiles that are going through these pet store chains or are being sold in reptile swaps than what you would see from a reputable breeder or, again, from an adoption option. Now, just to give you some ideas of where you can, again, go if you are looking to adopt a reptile. Again, local shelters may or may not have reptiles available. Some do, some don't. We do occasionally at DuPage, but more often than not, again, we do send out most of our reptiles to rescues. And I did put two up that we regularly work with. So Friends of Scales is a reptile-specific rescue that we work closely with on a regular basis. And then Fur Angels Animal Sanctuary. Now, I know the name Fur Angels would imply that probably they only have cats, dogs, and furry small animals, but they actually have a number of different reptiles, bearded dragons included, available for adoption pretty much constantly throughout the year. These are going to be great resources for you. They're pulling animals in need, they're providing that care, and they're going to really offer you a lot of insight into that animal's specific personality, likes and dislikes, and any advice to continue working with that pet. So if there are handling issues, they'll be able to provide you with guidelines as to how to continue to work on that and have a positive relationship with your dragon in your home. Now, if these rescues didn't work out for you, perhaps they don't have anything available or they're not within your area, you can find other bearded dragons and reptiles just generally available for adoption through internet searches. So Google is definitely your friend. You can look at specific rescue sites to see if they have reptiles available, or you can use some of the larger databases like Adopt-A-Pet or petfinder.com. You can search by specific species within a certain age range, even if you're interested, all within specified mileage from your home. So you can use these sites to find any potential adoptable bearded dragons in your area. And it's a really great resource to turn to. So I definitely advocate using one of these options if you are considering adding a bearded dragon to your home. Now, a lot of folks, when they want to add a bearded dragon to their home, they look at juvenile dragons. So little kiddos, like you see pictured here on the slide, these are typically the dragons that you're also going to see in the pet store. So little guys that are really only just maybe an inch or two long, weigh next to nothing. They are adorable as all get out. So I definitely understand the appeal. However, if you are a first-time bearded dragon owner, I would strongly recommend, again, I'm always going to push for that adoption option, but I would recommend bringing an adult dragon into your home. Doesn't have to be a senior dragon. It can just be a year old, but you want a dragon that's already gotten all of that important care in its developmental stages before you bring them home. Because with juvenile dragons, there's a lot of room for error here. And if they aren't cared for properly in these initial developmental stages, we can see lifelong health and behavioral issues as a result. So you really need to know your stuff to bring home a juvenile reptile and care for them properly. So baby bearded dragons are going to be especially sensitive to changes in heat and humidity. So you really have to be precise and consistent, and you have to know how to maintain your tanks to successfully house them. And they're going to need a very specific diet that has to be well balanced and, again, consistent and maintained as they grow and develop. And if there's an error made there with heat, humidity, or diet, you can permanently impact their growth and development. And then you're fighting an uphill battle for the rest of their lives, trying to keep them healthy. Now, additionally, you're going to have some challenges with socialization. So I bring my bearded dragon with me everywhere. She likes to go on car rides. We go to pet stores together. Pre-COVID days when we were doing educational programs at the shelter, Beetle has been around to help out with those as well. Bearded dragons are generally social and enjoy being held, but not so much when they're juveniles. They're not used to being held yet. They haven't been exposed to the world. So you have to work on that with them. So basically, when you're bringing home a baby beardy, you're bringing home a wild animal, and they're not going to want to interact with you. So reptiles aren't really domestic the way that cats and dogs are considered to be, where they have sort of an inherent interest in hanging out with people. Reptiles don't. So they're going to view us as predators. We're bigger than them. We loom over them. And oftentimes we pick them up in a way that a predator might. So they don't really want to hang out with us, especially when they're young and small and feeling extra vulnerable. So you have to be able to commit to daily handling sessions, and you have to be patient with them because they are not going to come around and be social and friendly right away. So that is definitely a concern. When you've got a young bearded dragon, they're not really going to want to spend time with you. There's going to be an inherent fear. And also, baby beardies are very busy creatures. They've got a lot to learn about their environment, and they're not going to be all that interested in sitting and snuggling with you the way an adult bearded dragon would. So I know that bearded dragons are often popular as pets because they seem to have this sort of sedate, la-di-da attitude, and they seem to enjoy hanging out with people. And that is absolutely true with a well-socialized and handled adult. Juveniles, even when you have that socialization down and they overcome that fear, they're too busy to hang out with us. They don't really want to spend time with us at all. So if you're looking for that calmer reptile, again, that's another reason to choose an adult over a youngster, especially when you're a first-time beardy owner. Now, when we talk about the setup for bearded dragons, size definitely matters when it comes to the tank that you choose. Now, in terms of the type of tank, you have a lot of options. I've seen many people use aquariums. That is fine, but when you do have a tank that is glass on all sides, except for the top where you would require some mesh for airflow, it's going to be more challenging maintaining appropriate heat and humidity there. So the humidity is going to be directly related to the humidity in your home because there's a lot more airflow through the top of that tank. And then heat tends to dissipate through that glass. So it's hard to keep them at their appropriate temperatures, which again can be challenging for our juvenile dragons. They need to be a pinch warmer than our adults do. So it's a little bit harder to maintain. You have to make sure that you have ample room for the dragons to turn around and explore, and that will be variable depending on the size of the dragon, whether again you've got a juvenile or an adult. And then of course there's some size differences in our adults as well. But typically you're looking at least 2 feet wide. You do want to allow some height for climbing, but you want to avoid any of the tanks or reptile cages that were specifically designed for climbers. So you'll see some that aren't terribly long but are quite high. Those are more for our geckos and our chameleons. Dragons will need something longer rather than tall, but we do want to have some space for them to climb because they are semi-arboreal. And when you choose your tank, you have to keep in mind that the tank needs are going to change as your beardy grows. And I advocate strongly against buying the big tank and letting your dragon grow into it. You really do want to start with something that's specific to their size. So if you do choose to go that juvenile dragon route, you don't want to put them in a giant tank because they're not going to be well adapted or adept at finding their heat source. So they can get a little lost, they'll get cold, they'll slow down, and they won't actually be able to physically get themselves to their basking area. So that can be a fatal error for juvenile dragons. So if you do get the big tank, you have to have a way to partition it so the dragon only has access to one area where there is a basking space, or you want to start with a small tank and then slowly upgrade the tank size as your dragon grows. So I have provided some general guidelines for your tank sizes. If you have a baby beardy, so that juvenile that's just the size of your finger, you're really looking for about a 20-gallon tank. You can go a little bit bigger, but again, you'd want to partition it down to make sure that that dragon is staying close to that basking site. Especially for our youngsters, they do need to be kept a pinch warmer than our adults. If your dragon is 10 to 16 inches from nose to tip of tail, you're looking at 40 gallons or larger. 16 to 20 inches, you're looking for a minimum of 50 gallons, but 75 gallons or larger is preferred. And if you've got a big kiddo that's 20 inches or longer, minimum of 75 gallons, but really 120 or larger is preferred. So they do require an ample amount of room. And that being said, even if you give them the biggest tank possible, dragons should still have at least an hour a day outside of that tank where they can move around and explore. So they do like to get out and stretch their legs, and it's important for their physical and mental health that they have the opportunity to do so. Now, when it comes to light, heat, and humidity, bearded dragons, with the exception of our juveniles, are pretty forgiving. So there are some reptiles where you do have to be very strict with the heat that's available to them. Dragons can, if they have a slightly cool day, you're okay. They usually can survive that. They're pretty hardy, so they can be forgiving if you have some temperature control issues at first. But generally speaking, during the day, you want a warm side of their tank to be about 90 to 105 degrees for adults. You can do about 110 degrees to 115 degrees for juveniles. So they need to be a little bit toastier to keep those young bodies growing and active. But with every tank, when you have your basking day temp, so you should have a basking light that will maintain that temperature, you also need to offer them a cool side. So again, remember, in the wild, dragons will semi-climb to warm up, and when they get cold, or when they get too warm and they need to cool off, they'll actually burrow underground. That can be difficult for us to provide in captivity. So instead, what we need to do is we need to provide a warm side of the tank and a cool side of the tank. So warm side, you want to be, again, for adults between 90 and 105 degrees, a little warmer for our juveniles. That cool side during the day, we want to have about 80 degrees. You can go down to about 75. And you can play with that a little bit based on the preference of your dragons. So my girl, especially as she's gotten older, she's pretty sensitive to heat. So her preferred warm side is really only about 90 degrees, maybe 92. And her cool side, she actually likes a little bit closer to 75 during the day. And I see her regularly move between the two to regulate her temperature. Now, for nighttime temps, generally speaking, you don't need to worry about maintaining any sort of heat source unless your house gets chilly, especially in the winter time. They can go down to about 60 to 65 degrees overnight when they are resting and they're kind of shut down themselves. So it can be a little bit cooler for them. So 60 to 65 degrees is appropriate. If you have a home that gets a little chillier than that and you find that your tank temperatures are dropping below 60 degrees. You will need to provide a heat source in the evening, but not a light source. So you don't need to have a basking light. You can use porcelain heaters. That's what I've used in the past when I've lived in a chillier home to maintain at least one warm area in the tank that will be at least that 65 degrees. I will advocate here for making sure that you don't use the nighttime red lights that you see sold in pet stores. I honestly don't know why we still sell those. They can be very detrimental to your dragon's eye health. So you don't want to have red lights in your tank, even though the light packaging actually has a bearded dragon on it. It is not intended for them, nor is it healthy for them to be exposed to those UV rays. Now, when it comes to humidity for our bearded dragons, they like 30 to 40% humidity. So they do like some moisture in the air. That is typically fairly easy to maintain if you've got a properly enclosed tank. If you tend towards the dry side, so if you're at 30% or lower, you can mist the environment lightly. And in fact, many bearded dragon owners will do that. They'll mist not the dragon themselves, but the environment around them, and you can mist some of their climbing structures. And bearded dragons will actually lick the water off. That's how they'll get a lot of their moisture. Some dragons like to drink out of a bowl. My dragon is a drinker, so she actually has a small pool that that I maintain for her in her tank, and she goes and drinks out of it. But she's kind of an odd duck. Most dragons don't do that, but they will lick the surfaces in their tank to get moisture. So you can give that a little spritz periodically. If you struggle with humidity over 40%, you might want to look at the airflow through your tank. You might need to increase it a little bit. They might be too tightly closed in. And they actually do sell dehumidifiers for reptile tanks. So occasionally you may need to place one of those in your reptile's enclosure. UVA and UVB lighting will be required for your bearded dragons. And you want to make sure that you have a UVA, UVB bulb at very least along their basking side. So on the warm side of their tank. I am very paranoid about my dragon not getting enough UVA, UVB because that can lead to bone density issues. So I actually have two lighting structures, one on her warm side and one on her cool side. So regardless of where she goes during the day to regulate her temperature, she always is exposed to those lights. They can get exposure also through direct sunlight, which is advocated for bearded dragons. So you can certainly place their tanks near windows. You just want to make sure that they have an option to get away from that sunlight if they want to. So they should have some sort of shade structure that they can hide in. And a lot of bearded dragons will actually enjoy going out and experiencing natural sun, which we'll talk about here in just a moment when we discuss enrichment. My bearded dragon, she's never been a big fan of being on the ground outside. She doesn't feel secure, and so we don't push that much with her, but she loves riding on shoulders. So when I take my dogs for walks, you can often find me walking a dog with a bearded dragon sitting on my shoulder as we go. And she likes to check out the neighborhood that way, and she gets a lot of natural UVA and UVB light too. Now, when we talk about our tanks as well, another common issue that we see with bearded dragons is inappropriate substrate. So when you are choosing the bedding for your tank or whatever floor you're going to put in there, you want to make sure that it is easy to clean. So it has to be something that's safe for your dragon and something that you can sanitize. So dragons can be prone to scale infections, so they can get bacterial infections. And a lot of that comes from dirty bedding. So you want to make sure when you're choosing a substrate, you're choosing something that's pretty simple to clean or easy to replace. So there are reptile carpet options that you can purchase at pet stores, and they are made with a lot of different materials. They can be made to almost look like grass, so they'll be green. You can get one that's brown, so it's more deserty if you're specific about that for your bearded dragon. And there's also even some that have fake rocks and sand attached to them. Those I'm not a big fan of. They look super neat, but if a dragon defecates on that type of carpet, it now just has to be thrown away because it's impossible to wash. But the other reptile carpets that are just either green or brown in color, if they defecate on those carpets, you can actually wash them with warm soapy water in a sink to kind of sanitize them, let them dry out, and you can place them back into their tank. You can go with just straight tile on the bottom of your bearded dragon's tank, which is what a lot of folks do. It's easy to clean, and that's going to be very similar to the sort of hard stony surface that a bearded dragon would be used to in its natural environment. Some folks will also choose to line tanks with newspaper or paper towels. Both are fine. They're easy to clean up. So if your dragon defecates, you just take that dirty piece of paper towel or newspaper out and then replace it. I personally am not a fan. One, it's not aesthetically pleasing, but two, it's not natural for the dragon. So it doesn't really provide any sort of sensory stimulation for them. So I tend to steer away from those, but it's all personal choice for you and for your lizard. Now, I get asked all the time, what about sand? So can I use sand for my bearded dragon? And my answer to that is that it's really an unnecessary risk. So bearded dragons taste everything. I've mentioned that several times. That's how they explore their environment. They taste it. They're going to taste the substrate that they're standing on as well. So that means they're going to be ingesting some of that sand. And especially for our young bearded dragons, that puts them at a high risk of impaction, where they'll get a blockage in their gut that can be fatal if not treated with some urgency from a veterinarian. There's also a higher risk of parasites because we really can't sterilize that sand. So we have a risk of infection, as well as sanitation issues. So if they defecate in that sand, you're going to try to scoop it up, but you're not going to get all of it. So that means that essentially we're leaving our bearded dragons to walk around in their own fecal matter, which is not hygienic for any animal, and something we certainly don't want to see our bearded dragons having to exist in. Now, at pet stores, you will see sand that is called calci sand, and it is advertised as safe for ingestion and that it has calcium in it for our bearded dragons. It still can cause impactions. So unnecessary risk. And again, still issues with parasites, still issues with sanitation. And I have seen a number of bearded dragon guardians that are keeping their pets in that calci sand. And again, I see the appeal because there's lots of different colors. You can make it funky and blue and red and green, but it also can stain your dragon's scales. So I've seen a lot of dragons coming out of tanks with that calci sand where their scales are stained green or blue. So anything that bleeds color like that, I have concerns with, and I personally wouldn't put my own animal in that. So to give you all an idea about what a tank should look like, this is my bearded dragon's enclosure. This is something that we actually built ourselves. So I apologize, the top area, we haven't completed our decorations yet. So I'm gonna add something there for her. But she has a tile floor, which she has available to her on this side so she can walk across the tile. I have chosen a reptile carpet. That's what's brown right here on this side for her. So she has two different textures that she can walk on for a little bit of tactile enrichment. She has two basking lights because my tank is about 5 feet long. So I like to make sure that she's got plenty of ample warm areas. Her cool side is over here. So she doesn't have a basking light, but you can see the UVA and UVB bulbs are on each side. She has some foliage, so you can actually see, there's my lizard right there, Beetle. She's hiding in the corner. She likes the foliage. I think it makes her feel secure. So we rearrange it from time to time, but we always have some draping down so she can hide. She has a little pillow there that she likes to sit on. She has a rope climbing structure here so she can climb. She has a small bridge to sit on as well for basking. This is her pool. So it's her water bowl that she actually soaks in on a regular basis as well. So I'll show you that. And then she can climb on her cave or go inside if she would like to hide or cool off. So she's got a lot of variety in her tank, and I change up its layout on a regular basis. So I have a variety of different climbing structures, different bridges and other stands for her to lay on to bask. And I actually have 2 or 3 different caves that I switch out on a regular basis to keep her environment new and exciting for her. But this is really what I'd like to see all bearded dragons living in. Her tank is 5 feet long. It's 2.5 feet wide. She's got ample space to move about. Great airflow. We never have issues with humidity, and maintaining the heat works really well here. And you can see I maintain a thermometer here. It also is a humidity gauge. And then I also have a temperature gun. That's the laser guns that you can use to monitor for temperature. I find those to be most accurate, and they'll give you a good idea of the temperature wherever you point that laser at. So you can see This, I believe, is reading at 97 degrees. It was a little warm for her that day, but that is 97 degrees right there for the tank. So when I use my laser gun, I can point it at the ground and see, is it really 97 there, or is it more 92 because we're a greater distance from the heat source? So I recommend all bearded dragon owners get one of those as well, just to make sure that you can appropriately monitor their temps. Now, if you have a dragon that is interested in digging, which is usually the biggest argument in the pro sand department, because dragons are natural diggers. That is a species specific behavior that we definitely would like to demonstrate. You can add a dig box for them. So Beetle, being a female, she also does periodically lay eggs. So I will see her sometimes sort of digging against the tile. And when I see that, I actually have a small litter box that I purchased for her. And we will put some children's play sand in there for her, or sometimes even potting soil. And I'll place that in her tank for a couple of days, or even sometimes just a couple hours each day, and allow her to demonstrate that behavior. It's a good physical exercise for her, and it does increase her mental well-being as well. But I don't keep it in there permanently, again, for safety and sanitation reasons. But you can certainly add one in there periodically for your dragon if you would like them to demonstrate those behaviors. All right, now, one of the biggest questions that I get and one of the biggest issues that we see with bearded dragons in captivity as pets is this idea of cohabitation. So humans are social creatures. So I know we've all felt the effects of the social distancing and sheltering in place that we just experienced. For many people, that was very trying, and it created a lot of emotional issues because we need physical contact. We need to interact with other individuals of our own species. And a lot of times when we have pets in our homes, we try to enforce that same need on them. But bearded dragons are 100% solitary, and they should not cohabitate under any circumstances. So you will see oftentimes when you go to pet stores, there will be tanks with 3, 4, or more juvenile bearded dragons in them. There are less safety concerns when they are juvenile, so sometimes you can get away with it, but definitely not as an adult. And even with the juveniles, you're taking an unnecessary risk. So bearded dragons are going to demonstrate dominance over resources. So one dragon is going to want that basking source, for example. They're going to want that heat. They're going to want that climbing structure. They're going to want that cave. And they're going to try to take it from any other dragon that is existing in their space. So when we see that, we see images like this. So this is something else that you may see online when you do some searches for bearded dragon husbandry. And most of the time when we see this, again, being people, being creatures that like close physical contact, we think, oh, they're snuggling. They are not snuggling. That dragon on top is being dominant. So he or she, I'm not sure, is trying to take a resource from the dragon below. So dragons absorb their heat from above. That's why those basking lights are so important. They don't have heat receptors on their belly, so they can't warm themselves from any heat below. They need to bask, and that dragon wants that basking source. So he or she is literally standing on top of that other dragon and stealing their heat. And that can be really detrimental to the dragon below. They may not be able to maintain consistent body temperature, which then impacts their digestion and can put them at risk for a number of health issues. You can also see unintentional mating. Not everyone can sex a bearded dragon appropriately, so you may have unwanted eggs that are fertilized, and then you have to deal with hatchlings as well, or disposal of those eggs, which can sometimes be a little bit emotionally trying. There's also a high risk of injury and unnecessary stress. So I have definitely heard from some folks that they've tried cohabitating two females and it's worked great, but almost always there's going to be an altercation. And the problem with that is that when bearded dragons do choose to fight with one another, it is violent and intense. So this is actually a dragon that came to a rescue because they were cohabitating. This dragon had cohabitated with another female for years and they had been fine. They got into one fight over who knows what. And this dragon lost the end of her tail and one of her feet in that altercation. So you can see she's missing a foot, she's missing her tail. and that's something obviously she's never going to recover from. So she was in immense pain, high risk of infection. It's very fortunate for her that she was able to survive, but now she's definitely a special needs dragon that will require extra care for the rest of her life because of that trauma that was caused all by cohabitation. So even if your dragons seem like they get along, they should not live together, because if something goes wrong, it is violent and it's tragic, and we want to avoid that. We can also see potential health risks as well. So we can see an increased likelihood of parasitic infections, and then of course those injuries. And if you do have two bearded dragons that are living together, if there are size differences, we also have to worry about predation. So this is another scenario that unfortunately we've encountered quite a bit, where we have one adult dragon. That dragon's only a year old, and the owner thought that perhaps they could introduce another juvenile, and even thought that by introducing a juvenile there would be less risk of dominance issues. But because that other bearded dragon was smaller, it now became food. So you can definitely see that occurring as well. So it is a good idea to maintain, if you have multiple bearded dragons, maintain them in separate tanks. Now, when we are talking about balancing our meals for our bearded dragons, depending on their age, they are going to have different needs. So juvenile dragons are going to be primarily carnivorous. So even though they are omnivorous as a species, when they are young, they have higher protein needs. So their diet should consist of 80% insects and 20% vegetables. Fruits can be given as occasional treats, and that will ring true for both juveniles and adults. While fruit are certainly tasty items, they don't have a lot of nutritional value for dragons. So you can use them as a topper to entice them if they're not super interested in their salads, but it shouldn't be a main feature in their meals. So for juveniles, it's going to be primarily bugs with a little bit of a salad offered as well. For adult dragons, they actually flip-flop. So as they become adults, they become primarily herbivorous. So then you're going to see 80% vegetables with, again, those occasional fruit treats. You're shooting for about 5% of their diet. And then 20% insects or other protein sources. So you can certainly feed them pinkies, baby mice, and other sources. So this is actually my bearded dragon in her dig tank. So she actually has a smaller tank that has a natural substrate for her to dig in, and I fed her breakfast in there. She actually is enjoying a small amount of scrambled egg in that picture. Not something you should supply to them regularly, but for an occasional treat. That was her birthday last year, actually. She gets a little scrambled egg every year, and that's a good protein source for her on occasion, and something that she definitely enjoys. Now, when you are choosing food items for your bearded dragon, the food should not be wider than the space between their eyes. So you want to make sure that it's not thicker than that space between their eyes there. If it is, it can pose a choking risk for them. So you want to make sure you are choosing size-specific food, which again is more challenging for your juveniles. A lot of insects are going to be too large for them, so you have to get small crickets and other worms and things like that for them. There's a lot more leniency for our adult dragons. And they're also just going to be more proficient at chewing their food than their youngsters, so they're less likely to choke. But you do want to make sure that you're not getting anything that's excessively large. So these are some of the preferred foods for your bearded dragons. For vegetables, collard greens are almost always my go-to. They're very nutrient dense, and bearded dragons love them. Why? I don't know. I feel like that is one of the most bitter greens available, but bearded dragons almost always universally love them. You can also do beet greens, mustard greens, turnip greens, bok choy. You can include carrots, sprouts, broccoli. You can do cooked sweet potato, but not raw. And then to a lesser extent, spinach, chard, kale. There are a lot of available options for you. You can also give them flowers, both regular hydrated flowers, or a lot of pet stores will sell dehydrated versions as well that you just moisten a bit before you provide to them. Those are all fine options. With flowers, my only caveat with that is dandelions, for example, are a tried and true favorite of every bearded dragon I have ever met. I advocate for not picking those out of yards because you never know if anyone has sprayed pesticides or herbicides in that yard, and that can be very damaging to your dragon. So these are things that you would want to purchase from a pet store, or you can't even get dandelion greens at some grocery stores. You would want to make sure that you're getting them from a safe environment. For fruit, there are a lot of options. Again, these are items that you would only give in small portions as treats. I listed these actually in the order of my bearded dragon's preference, but you may find through trial and error that your dragon may have some different choices. But strawberries and raspberries are usually pretty big hits. Bananas, apples are fine as well. Again, just making sure you're chopping them up to be size specific. Mangoes, grapes, figs, apricots, and dates. Apricots and dates are actually fairly nutrient dense, so those are good options. And then for your insects, crickets are usually the go-to for most folks. That's fine. They're great in moisture, decent in fat, not too high, not too low, and excellent sources of protein. Dubia roaches are also an excellent choice. That's one of my dragon's favorites. You can do hornworms. They're a little pricier, but they are great for moisture. So if you feel like your bearded dragon might be a pinch dehydrated, that is definitely a great choice for them. I give my dragon a hornworm once a week. They're pretty large and fat, but that provides her with a lot of moisture. So she gets one once a week. You also have silkworms, waxworms, superworms, and mealworms as options. Now, while a lot of these options are things that you can include in their regular diet, there are a few that are now colored here in red that you want to make sure you're giving in moderation and you're paying close attention to. So spinach, chard, kale would be on there too, if I could have fit it on the slide. Those are items that are often very popular for bearded dragons to consume, but they contain oxalate, which is a calcium binder. So that means that any calcium that you provide for your bearded dragon, which is a necessary part of their diet, which we'll discuss here in a moment, is canceled out by that spinach and that chard. So it's certainly stuff that you can give infrequently or in small amounts, but you do want to make sure that you have alternative greens to offer that allow them to uptake the calcium that they need. Silkworms, waxworms, superworms, and mealworms. Again, all great options to feed your bearded dragons, but they do need to be given in moderation. So silk, wax, and superworms can be very fatty. So if those are the primary insect that your dragon is eating, especially if they're adult dragons, they're going to get a little hefty, and we want to avoid that. Mealworms, not all dragons, but enough have demonstrated some issues with properly digesting them. So I do like to put them on there sort of a caution. They can sometimes cause impactions because they're just not as easy to digest. They're a great protein source, but just give them and watch your dragon carefully to make sure that their fecal matter is consistent and regular after being fed mealworms, because that can sometimes cause some issues. I've seen issues enough that I personally don't feed my dragon mealworms, but on the flip side of that, I've known plenty of dragons that have been sustained almost entirely on mealworms and do just fine. So it's one of those, it seems to depend on your individual dragon. And so that's going to be a personal choice for you and for your pet. Now, for all food offered to your dragons, they should be dusted with calcium and D3 supplements at least several times a week. So it doesn't have to be every time you feed, but you want to shoot for at least 3 to 4 times a week. You're going to be doing a dusting to ensure that your dragon is getting the calcium and vitamin D that they need to maintain appropriate bone density. So that's going to be something important to watch for when you're feeding your dragon. Now, when we talk about handling for our bearded dragons, again, if you've got a juvenile, this is going to be more challenging. If you're bringing home an adult, hopefully they've already been well socialized, but in either case, you want to make sure that you allow for agency. So I see a lot of small pets, reptiles and others, where they're not given a lot of choice in their life, and that can cause a lot of stress and mental unhealth. So we want to have our bearded dragons choosing to interact with us. So we don't want to force any handling that they're not comfortable with. So allow the dragon to approach you. You can encourage the dragon to step into your palm, and you can sometimes do that by providing a lure. So find that tasty snack that they love more than anything and place that on your palm and ask them to walk up to you. Bearded dragons can also learn They're not quite as easy to train as, say, a dog or a cat would be, but they can learn some basic skills. So my dragon actually has a step-up cue that I provide, and she steps up onto my palm, and then she's rewarded with a small treat. If she chooses to not step up, then I allow her that agency to choose not to interact with me, and I know that she's maybe not super interested in being handled right then. In either case, whether you want to invest that time to train with your bearded dragon or not, you want to make sure that if you are picking them up, we're scooping underneath them rather than coming from above to pick them up. Keep in mind that bearded dragons, when they are preyed upon in the wild, it's often from larger animals, frequently from birds of prey, that are going to swoop down and scoop them from above. So if we're picking them up that way, we're already creating a stressful, intense environment, and we may have that bearded dragon react negatively to the handling, which we do want to avoid. Now, when your bearded dragons are well socialized, they love to snuggle. I have not met a socialized bearded dragon that doesn't like a solid cuddle. They'll like to snuggle close to you. They're going to steal some of your warmth. So close proximity to skin is a big win for them. I've also found that most bearded dragons really enjoy soft textures. So that's why my dragon, she has a little fleece pillow in her tank. She lays on that almost constantly, regardless of where I put it in her tank. She finds it, and that's where she spends a lot of her time. So when I bring her out to snuggle with me on the couch, I have a fleece blankie. I actually wrap her up in, and she snuggles into it, and she will pass out almost immediately and sleep with me because she loves that soft texture. You also want to make sure that we're not causing any over arousal when we're handling. So if your bearded dragon's coming out for snuggle time, you want to keep the environment as peaceful as possible. So make sure it is appropriately warm for them. So it doesn't have to be 95 degrees, but you don't want to be bringing them out and handling them. If, say, I don't know, for whatever reason, your furnace broke in the winter and your house is only 55 or so degrees, that's too cold. And, and even in the winter, when maybe we're maintaining our houses at 65 degrees or so, bearded dragons can certainly come out for a little bit. But they're going to need some breaks to go back into that heat so they can maintain appropriate bodily functions. Bearded dragons are also going to be more relaxed if you have dim lighting rather than a lot of bright overhead lights on them. So that's something to be mindful of when you're bringing them out, particularly if you are working with a dragon that wasn't used to being handled much. Now, the last two things that we're going to cover with our bearded dragons will be medical care and enrichment. So medical issues, I definitely want to touch on. Unfortunately, with my experience with bearded dragon owners, a lot of these issues are missed until they become very severe. So I definitely like to touch on these. And I do stress that even though our bearded dragons are not going to get vaccines every year like our dogs or cats might, they should still have regular vet visits. So annual wellness checks are advised. My bearded dragon goes in at least once a year for a checkup just to make sure that she's healthy and squared away. But what I like to definitely draw attention to for any potential bearded dragon owners is that when you are taking your bearded dragon to the vet, whether it's for a wellness exam or for an emergency, they do have to go to an exotic veterinarian. So most veterinarians that treat our cats and dogs, they aren't capable of treating our reptiles. So that is a specialization in vet school. Some practices that have multiple vets on staff will have an exotic vet, but not all do. So before you bring a bearded dragon home, make sure you've identified an exotic veterinarian in your area. And you also have to be prepared for the extra cost. So typically in this area, a regular just vet visit for a dog or cat ranges anywhere from $40 to about $65 just for the vet exam itself. For a reptile or other exotic pet, it's typically about twice that. So you're looking at anywhere from $80 to maybe even $120 just for the vet to examine your pet. So of course, if there's an emergency, you can imagine those costs can get pretty hefty pretty quickly. So that's definitely something to be prepared for if you're going to be bringing a bearded dragon into your home. And while bearded dragons are generally hardy, as long as they receive proper care, there are some typical, or hopefully not too typical in some cases, health issues that you do need to be able to monitor for. So respiratory infections can be problematic for bearded dragons, and that's something to be concerned with if your bearded dragon is in an environment that is too humid for them. So if you're struggling with humidity, you want to watch for respiratory infections. You'll be able to tell they'll have a pretty raspy breath. You'll see a lot more open mouth breathing from them. That is an emergency situation for a bearded dragon, and they will need to see a veterinarian promptly. Bearded dragons can also suffer from adenovirus, which is something that we see a lot with commercially bred reptiles. This is a neurological condition, and unfortunately it's one that is not easily treatable, and in many cases is not treatable at all. So it is a fatal condition for our bearded dragons. You'll see uncoordinated movements, unintentional spasming, seizures, and then eventually death. Dragons can also get infectious stomatitis, otherwise known as mouth rot. You can actually see that here in this bearded dragon. So there's a dark spot here and here on their mouth. So that is a bacterial infection. Again, something that is emergent for bearded dragons. So once that happens, it can actually get into their jaw and cause bone degradation as well. So you want to make sure you're regularly monitoring the mouth of your bearded dragon. I do that with my beardie. I hand feed her insects, and so she'll open her mouth to receive her insect, and I can take a quick gander in there to make sure everything looks healthy and appropriate for her. We also see issues with parasitic infections, again, especially in our juveniles, and especially in our juveniles that are coming from these commercial situations. And they're definitely going to be more common in reptiles that are existing in either sand, or there are some other wood shaving and pelleted beddings. They're more likely to carry parasites with them. And of course, just like with us, anytime you feed a reptile any greens or fruits, make sure you're washing them properly before you provide them. And that will help ward off any parasites. When you take your bearded dragon for an annual wellness exam, you can bring a fecal sample, which is something I do every year and advocate strongly for, and they can check for parasites just to make sure that your beardie is healthy. A good indicator if they are suffering from a parasitic infection, you'll see their stools, which should be firm with a small amount of white in there. That's their urate, so they don't urinate, they just excrete the urate in their feces. If the feces become more liquidy, and more diarrhea inconsistency, that's usually a hallmark of a parasitic infection. And then probably the most concerning, but unfortunately one of the most common things that we see in bearded dragons is metabolic bone disease. And this is caused by inappropriate lighting, so an inadequate exposure to UVA, UVB lights, and inadequate supplementation with calcium and D3. So this is a very severe case of metabolic bone disease, but I do like to show it just so, I think my video is not working. There we go. All right, so this is a bearded dragon that ended up at a rescue with severe metabolic bone disease. Give this just a moment. I think I may be having some internet issues given the storm, so if it won't load, there we go. Let's dial down that music here just a little bit. So you can see already the deformities in this reptile. Let's just go ahead and kill that. So you can see that sunken look, so metabolic bone disease. They will also have a hard time with nutrient absorption. You can see how curved her legs are here. So this is not natural. And when put next to a robust, healthy bearded dragon, you can see how weak and frail she looks. She is got some caving in on her sides. Her legs are unnaturally bent. You can see that she's not actually able to physically support herself as well. As that disease progresses, you'll even see some malformation in their jaw. It'll almost start to collapse in and out of on itself, and basically their bones start to kind of curl and crumple in on each other. So this is incredibly painful. If caught early, it can be correctable, but when it's allowed to get to this severity, as we see here in this poor lizard, there's nothing really that can be done. So the only option is humane euthanasia. So we definitely want to avoid that, which is why diet and lighting are particularly important for our bearded dragon friends. Now, the last thing that I want to touch on for our bearded dragons are the enrichment options available. So because reptiles are a little slower and they live life a lot differently than we do, this is something that's often overlooked, but all animals enjoy enrichment, including reptiles, and they should definitely be allowed to demonstrate species-specific behaviors. So bearded dragons, again, as they reach adulthood, they're largely herbivorous, but they still do enjoy a good hunt. So a great way to enrich them is to purchase cat toys. So this is a great video of a bearded dragon enjoying a little cat ball. So he's biting at it and chasing it a little bit as it scoots across the floor. This this is great enrichment for a bearded dragon. My bearded dragon is actually really partial to the cat balls with the bells in them. She likes that noise. And I regularly will put ping pong balls into her tank as well, because when she does try to bite it, it just scoots away from her. So she'll start chasing after it again. So this is a great way for her to demonstrate species specific behavior. You can also allow them to hunt their own insects. I just advocate for not doing that in their tank. You would want to have a separate Rubbermaid tubs are often used where you can drop the insects in, put your bearded dragon in, and let them hunt. You don't want to leave insects in their tank unattended because those insects can actually bite your bearded dragon and cause infections in their skin. So you want to make sure that they're fed in a separate area, and anything they don't eat is then taken out of that environment, or they're removed from that environment for their safety. Now, other options, you can take your bearded dragon outside. There are bearded dragon harnesses. Some dragons will really enjoy this, especially if they've been exposed to it at a young age. Some dragons like mine are not comfortable on the ground because they have that natural inherent fear of predation. But like mine, they may enjoy being carried around outside. So that is certainly an option for you as well. And if you are concerned about a harness not being a secure option for your dragon, you can certainly set up little mini playpens for them as well, so they can enjoy that great outdoors. But with bearded dragons, you do want to make sure that you are supervising them when they are outside, because there is a very real threat of predation for them. It's not just perceived by them, it is real. In this area, if hawks happen to spot them from above, they definitely look tasty to them. So you want to make sure that you're protecting your dragon if they are enjoying the great outdoors. Inside, there are a lot of choices for you. Bearded dragons, again, they love soft. So I know a lot of folks will add stuffed animals into their environment for them. That is definitely an option. My dragon doesn't have a stuffed animal, but she's got her soft pillow. So she enjoys that. You can provide climbing structures. So this is my girl here on her bridge. She has a different rope climbing structure right there behind her. And you can also change up their tanks. So my dragon, about once a week, once every week and a half, I will take her out, let her run around in the house, and I completely revamp her tank. So I've got a variety of different bridges, caves, rope climbing structures, hammocks, and I just switch them all around. I'll switch their placement. I'll switch the type of structure that I have in there, just to spice up her world a little bit and give her new things to explore. You can also provide water enrichment for your dragons. Some like to swim. My girl hates to swim, but she likes to soak. So I have a deep water bowl in her tank. I keep it on her cool side, so that way we don't have a lot of evaporation and humidity concerns, but you can often find her soaking in it like you can here. She's enjoying having that water to really hydrate herself with. She's especially a fan of it when she's shedding. So that can be an option, whether it's something you include in their tank or something you provide by filling up a small tub or a sink with some water and letting them soak and swim around in there, depending on your dragon's preference. That can be a great way to enrich them. Okay, so that ends my bearded dragon discussion for you. So hopefully I didn't overwhelm you with too much information, but this is a great starter for getting yourself ready for bearded dragon ownership. It doesn't look like we had any specific questions, so that's fine for today. If anybody does have questions later on, I'm always happy to answer them. I love questions. I can be reached via email at humane.education@dupageco.org. So never hesitate to reach out if a question pops up later, or you're not sure about where to acquire a bearded dragon, or you've got some specific concerns about the bearded dragon that you currently have in your home. I'm always here and happy to help. So thank you for joining me tonight. I hope you have a lovely evening. Bye-bye.